विनम्रता दो ईश मेरे, विनम्रता दो ईश मेरे। मेरी चेतना करो जीवंत, हे माँ प्रेम खड्ग से अहंकार करो तुम अंत। विनम्रता दो ईश मेरे, मेरी चेतना करो जीवंत, हे माँ प्रेम खड्ग से अहंकार करो तुम अंत। विनम्रता दो ईश मेरे। मम मानस अतीव तुच्छ, मम मानस अतीव तुच्छ, तेरे समक्ष नहीं मैं कुछ। जननी पालू स्पर्श तेरा, जननी पालू स्पर्श तेरा। उठे हृदय आनंद तरंग, विनम्रता दो ईश मेरे। मेरी चेतना करो जीवंत, हे माँ प्रेम खड्ग से अहंकार करो तुम अंत। विनम्रता दो ईश मेरे। दिव्य चेतना के समक्ष कितना तुच्छ ये अहं। राह कठिन है हाथ पकड़ो, राह कठिन है हाथ पकड़ो। जननी चलो मेरे संग, जननी चलो मेरे संग। विनम्रता दो ईश मेरे, मेरी चेतना करो जीवंत, हे माँ प्रेम खड्ग से अहंकार करो तुम अंत। अहंकार करो तुम अंत, अहंकार करो तुम अंत।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. The devotional song that you heard just now was about humility, one of the most important qualities required on the spiritual path. It's one of the 12 virtues in the mother symbol, in the outermost circle, in the 12 petals, and one of them is humility. It's so easy to get drunk almost with our own importance, and doesn't really take much to do that. And therefore, and the one on the spiritual path is not immune to it. In fact, that person sometimes starts feeling that I'm different, I am one notch above the rest of humanity. And therefore, humility is something which is extremely important. And from the spiritual angle, it is also extremely rational. Because while we should be aware of our self-worth, what we have to realize is that whatever we are worth is because of what we have received from the divine. Whether it be the talents with which we are born, or be it what we have been able to acquire and accomplish as a result of the circumstances in which we have been placed. So those circumstances are also a part of what we have been given. It reminds me of what a psychologist Skinner once said, without any reference to spirituality or the divine. And still he put every creative person at his place by saying that a creative person is no different from any woman who creates a baby. You know, almost every woman creates a baby or is capable of doing so. And we don't look upon that as a creativity. It says that a poet is able to create a poem for the same reasons for which, or through the same mechanisms by which a woman creates a baby. It's possible for her to create a baby because of her genes and the circumstances in which she is placed. The same applies to the poet also. He's able to create the poem because of the genes that he has and the circumstances in which he is placed. So much for humility, which is rational from the spiritual angle, as well as even if you keep spirituality out and think only in the mental terms. Today's session is on a hodgepodge sort of type of topics, but all the same closely interrelated, as you might have seen: antioxidants, nutraceuticals, and phytochemicals, and so on. And we shall see why all these have been put together. In a way, they have been put together because these have been our concern in modern science only for the last about 50 years. Before that, we didn't really think in terms of these and were quite satisfied with the traditional nutrients and their traditional functions. So with this background, let's now go to the PowerPoint. Glory to the Master and the Divine Mother. The YES program is a part of the 150th birth anniversary celebrations of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Just for recapitulation, the traditional nutrients are just 6: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, the nutrients that give energy, vitamins, minerals, and water that do not give energy. And the traditional functions of food are to provide energy and to build the body for repair of wear and tear throughout life, and also for growth during childhood, during the growing period. The new knowledge that we have seen multiplying at an exponential rate during the last 50 years or so is that the nutrients are not just these 6, but could be in hundreds. And the functions of food are also more than 2. And one of the functions of the food seems to be to prevent and treat disease. And another thing that has been discovered is that for nutrients like vitamins and minerals, the requirements for optimal health may be more than for preventing deficiency, because till recently, the recommended dietary allowances were based on the amount that was sufficient to prevent deficiency. But then it was realized that that may be lower than the amount that will give us optimal health. And therefore, there has been an upward revision progressively for the recommended dietary allowances for these micronutrients, nutrients which are required in very small amounts, the vitamins and minerals. So this is the new knowledge. And that has given us some of these products and terms. The non-traditional nutrients are the nutrients other than the traditional 6. And one term which is very commonly used is functional foods. Every food is in a sense functional because it has some functions. But then what it has come to mean is foods, the functions of which go beyond the traditional functions. This again may not be restricted to only certain specified foods, but some foods which have been promoted as health foods have come to acquire this label more than the foods like ordinary foods like grains and fruits and vegetables. Although they also have not just the traditional functions, but also they also help in preventing disease and sometimes treating disease. So functional foods in current parlance means foods, the functions of which go beyond the traditional functions. And based on this idea of functional foods has grown an industry which is called nutraceuticals, which is a combination of nutrition and pharmaceuticals, as you can see, which means that just as we have pharmaceuticals manufacturing drugs, we also have companies manufacturing similar products under which come pills and capsules packed with various nutrients, as well as some fortified foods, health foods, dietary supplements. All these are sometimes clubbed under this term nutraceuticals. So in short, they are formulations which incorporate non-traditional nutrients or functional foods. But is all this knowledge really new? Ayurveda has always had a big overlap between what is ordinary diet and what we can use for staying healthy and for treating disease. Ahar has been one of the main pillars in Ayurveda for staying healthy as well as a part of the treatment. And this has further been sort of fine-tuned to the prakriti of the person, to the season, and so on. So Ayurveda has really not ever distinguished. So, and therefore, this knowledge is not really very new. Not only in Ayurveda, but also in modern medicine. Hippocrates, who is considered the father of modern medicine, said in 400 BC, which means about 2,500 years ago, let food be thy medicine. So using food as medicine for either preventing disease or treating disease was something that he also talked about. But then why do we call it new? It's in keeping with the usual trend in human affairs. As Sri Aurobindo says in Savitri, a circuit ending where it first began, that is when the circle is complete, you reach where you first began. But then because you have traveled so much, to come back to the same place where you first began, you start looking at it as progress. A circuit ending where it first began is dubbed the forward and eternal march of progress on perfection's unknown road. Now let's start with antioxidants. A term that is very commonly used. Chemicals which are more or less ubiquitous, found in just about every food. And a term which to some extent also conveys the mechanism by which these nutrients act. In a way, they are against something which may be related to oxidation or oxygen. So let's have a little look at some of the basics of this, what antioxidants are all about. We use carbohydrates and fats and to some extent proteins as fuel. And as in the case of, say, wood, when we burn wood or any other fuel, we use oxygen. And as a result of this process, which we call burning or combustion, we get energy, and two of the byproducts are also carbon dioxide and water. The food is utilized in more or less the same way. With the help of oxygen from the air, we get from food energy and also carbon dioxide and water as byproducts. But one of the byproducts of this process of oxidation are free radicals or reactive oxygen species, which can react with many of the other chemicals present in the body. They can damage fats, they can damage proteins, they can damage nucleic acids. And we can understand the implications because lipids and proteins put together are the two major components of all cell membranes. The cell membrane is essentially a lipoprotein structure. And if that gets damaged, then one can understand that it will have implications for the whole body because the cells all over the body have these membranes, and particularly affected will be those parts of the body where either the functioning of the cells is critical for good health or survival, or in those areas where these cells are rapidly dividing so that the new cells that are formed may not have healthy membranes. And the nucleic acids, again, they are the ones that translate the genetic code into proteins, and how a cell functions and behaves depends on the proteins that it manufactures, and therefore any damage to the nucleic acids will also be damaging. And the consequences of damage by these free radicals or reactive oxygen species have been considered to be aging. Aging has been attributed partly to this very process. One of the theories of aging is that we age because no matter what mechanisms we have available in the body, some amount of this damage keeps happening throughout life. And the slow accumulation of damage is what leads to aging. This is one of the theories. Of course, there are other theories for aging apart from this, but this is one of them. And this damage can also impair immunity because to the immune system belong cells which divide rapidly. And it can also lead to cancer because prevention of cancer is also a function of the immune system. It is in a constant surveillance by the immune system, looking out for cells which do not seem to belong to the body, that early cancer is eliminated. As soon as some cells break out of the normal cycle and there is some sort of an aberration in the normal cell cycle in which the number of cells produced is exactly the same as the number of cells dying, and the new cells formed are exactly of the same type as those which have died. When there's something that goes wrong with this delicately balanced mechanism, one gets cancer cells which look different, divide far more rapidly, and are functionless. They are not able to function like the normal cells. And these cells then can be identified as not belonging to the body. At least they don't belong to the normal body. And the immune system treats them as an invasion by some foreign cells and eliminates them. And therefore, we remain blissfully unaware of any early development of cancer, which is taking place in all of us all the time. And we don't even know it. But then when the immune system is weak, these cells, because of the weakening of the immunological surveillance, get an opportunity to divide rapidly and grow into a full-blown tumor. So these are some of the consequences of damage by these free radicals. But then luckily we have preventive mechanisms which avoid this damage or at least slow it down, minimize it to the extent possible. And there are several inbuilt antioxidant mechanisms in the body. But then these are further supplemented by dietary antioxidants, particularly with vitamin A, C, and E among the traditional nutrients, and several non-traditional nutrients. And sometimes there's an overlap. For example, selenium is a mineral. It's one of the traditional nutrients, but then it helps in the synthesis of an antioxidant within the body. So the inbuilt antioxidant mechanisms may require a nutrient for functioning properly. So the dietary antioxidants include vitamins A, C, and E, selenium, and several phytochemicals. One can almost generalize that apart from these traditional nutrients, all the other antioxidants have been found in plants. And therefore, they can be grouped under phytochemicals. And these are the protective chemicals in plant foods. Phyto just means plants. So these are chemicals found in plants. They may have phytochemicals, that is chemicals found in plants, may have functions other than protective functions, but then this is one of the functions that these chemicals have, and now we know hundreds of them. But we do not know whether all of them are required all the time, what quantity they are required, and so on. But the general assumption is that they are overlapping functions, and so long as we have a variety of them, we can stay in good health. How did it all begin, this whole area of phytochemicals? It all started with dietary fiber in the 1970s when two British physicians, Dennis Burkitt and Surgeon Captain Cleve, who were educated in the UK but went to work in Africa, observed that many diseases that they had seen very commonly in the UK hardly existed in Africa, and they attributed it to the difference in the diet. And one of the things that they focused on was dietary fiber. So since fiber is found only in plants, we can consider all that complex of chemicals, which is called dietary fiber, to be the first set of phytochemicals that were discovered in recent history. But then followed hundreds of other phytochemicals, and the effects of these were they acted either as antioxidants. Some of them had a weak estrogenic effect. Some of them had anti-thyroid effect, but they could have many other effects. But all the same, hardly any of these appears to be really harmful, because these items have been acceptable as foods only because they were not doing us any major harm, and at the same time, they were doing us a lot of good, although modern science didn't recognize it till about the 1960s or 70s, because we thought that these 6 major nutrients, the traditional nutrients, are the ones that we need. Anything else that is present in a food just happens to be something redundant. It happens to be there, but it is functionless. It may be harmless, and therefore it is passive. So everything else was looked upon as passive and redundant components of food, which are inevitable because they happen to be there in the food. And that applied also to dietary fiber. But then we realized that dietary fiber was important because like everything good in life, like the husband or the wife, we realize his or her importance when he or she is not there. So when dietary fiber was not there, as in European diets, they found that it had some value. And then, it followed a large number of other chemicals, and it was again realized or intuitively guessed that just as fiber is not just redundant or passive, the same may apply to other chemicals also. And it was found that, true enough, they were also helpful. And this happened by and large by observing ancient cultures, observing their diets, which kept them healthy, and then trying to look at one or the other aspect of these traditional diets, be it an Indian diet or a Mediterranean diet or an African diet or a Latin American diet, all these diets which were ancient, which belong to ancient cultures, they were looked at. And it was found that many of these populations which had preserved the traditional patterns of diet were healthier than those who had adopted the changes which happened in Europe and North America over the last 100 years or so, particularly after the Industrial Revolution. And that was the sort of beginning of the identification of this large number of chemicals. And it was found that all the protective factors were in fact found in plant foods, and therefore they were called phytochemicals. In contrast, the chemicals that were found in non-vegetarian food, in foods of animal origin, were by and large found to be harmful to health. So the overall effect of these phytochemicals is protective. And the major mechanism known is as antioxidants, but then this can translate into enhancing immune function. It can also translate into an anti-infective function, because if immunity is good, then infections are less likely and one will recover from infections much better. Anti-tumor activity, because as we saw, if immunity is better, cancer will also be prevented, and it might help in treatment of cancers. And then, as in case of dietary fiber, it was found that many other chemicals also helped in controlling blood sugar and blood cholesterol levels and blood triglycerides levels and so on. So hypoglycemic effect, hypolipidemic effect. So the major function may be antioxidant, but then it can translate into many other functions. And this helps in studying these phytochemicals. It also helps particularly the industry which is trying to study some particular health food or some particular chemical, because then they can do a large number of studies, some focusing on immunity and some on infection, some on cancer, some on blood sugar and blood lipids. And so if the same food is shown to have all these effects, although the underlying mechanism may be the same, but if all these effects are seen, then they can say that, well, this food helps in preventing infections, it helps in preventing cancer, it helps in preventing heart disease, it helps in preventing diabetes. So it becomes a selling point. So that's how you can do a large number of studies on the same substance and show these different types of effects. The sources of phytochemicals are these plant foods, whole grains, cereals and pulses, fruits and vegetables, spices, and nuts. But then many of these have been packed as health foods, and also some of them have been packed in very concentrated amounts in capsules and pills, and that is what nutraceuticals are about. Now, when we know that there are hundreds of chemicals that the body needs, and they're all important for staying healthy, just getting the traditional nutrients is not enough. When all that has been realized, it's natural to have this suspicion that all the nutrients that we really need for all the functions that food can have may not be adequate in a diet made up of natural foods alone. While this suspicion is natural, the simple solution to this would be to make a conscious choice to consciously eat more of the foods that have a high concentration of nutrients that might generally get neglected. What generally gets neglected are these things like dietary fiber, because refined foods can be much more palatable than unrefined foods, and fruits and vegetables may be considered accessories and may get neglected. Some people take great pride in not having any spices in their food. They feel that they are able to give up this sensory pleasure and there's something superior about it. So there are certain type items of food which may get neglected, and in that process, many of these phytochemicals may get neglected, protective foods may get neglected. So a simple solution to this issue would be to consciously eat more of the foods that have a high concentration of nutrients that might get generally neglected, which means have more of whole grains, fruits and vegetables, and spices, and to some extent, nuts. So these are the type of foods that one can incorporate consciously in the diet. But then this type of a simple solution may not suit everybody. And what suits better is to give another set of arguments. If it is so difficult to eat such a large variety of foods, and still you are not sure that you are getting enough, these nutrients, these non-traditional nutrients, all these antioxidants and so on, don't have to come from natural foods. Why can't you take them in the form of something which has been packaged into a very convenient form for you? We can even put the active principle or a very concentrated supply of some of these in a tablet or a capsule. And these should not be taken in the spirit of drugs. These are not drugs. These are items of your diet. These are items of food. You are taking them because you are not sure whether you are getting enough of them from natural foods, and because it is more convenient to take a few tablets than to think about taking such a large variety of foods. And in some cases, compounds with a function very similar to these phytochemicals can be synthesized in the laboratory, and they can be a substitute for the natural nutrients. And therefore, the industry has capitalized on this, and using this type of arguments has come up with a large variety of products with varying degree of deviation from natural foods. Some of them are just natural foods, but packaged and marketed as health foods. In some cases, they have been fortified, and in some cases, including dietary fiber. When dietary fiber was discovered as something important, industry came up with even capsules containing dietary fiber. Much easier to do that than to take unrefined foods. So these are the type of solutions that suit the industry. So the result has been a wide variety of nutraceuticals, which include various dietary supplements, health foods, fortified foods, and pills and capsules containing a single nutrient or a group of nutrients, or the active principle of a food, or a synthetic substitute for a nutrient, or any substance likely to have a physiological benefit. So all these have been grouped together under nutraceuticals. But then you can't promote things in today's world where the word scientific has become synonymous with everything that is good, valid, and worthwhile without doing some scientific research on what you're promoting. So the industry sponsored a lot of research on these foods, whatever food they were interested in. But there are flaws in this research. The research has been by and large on single foods: tea or coffee, nuts, chocolate, tomato, etc., etc. Now, if you study any of these foods, you will be easily able to show a beneficial effect, because you can easily show that, yes, they do help in preventing cancer or heart disease or diabetes and so on. While that research is true, it is only part of the truth, and that's what makes all the difference. Because while this particular food that has been studied, be it green tea or be it a particular nut, while this particular food does it, that is not the only food that does it. Because somebody else might be studying something else, say tomato or chocolate, and they would also show the same thing. And then probably if one were to do studies also on foods which are not so glamorous and expensive, they would also do the same thing. So therefore, part of the truth can be sometimes more dangerous than ignorance. So by not only coming up with part of the truth, but also magnifying it and talking a lot about it, this particular food may get promoted, but that is not something which is really entirely desirable for a balanced diet. For example, tomatoes have a chemical, a phytochemical called lycopene. This has been studied quite a lot, and it has been packed into capsules, which can be given. Once I was attending a talk organized by the company which was marketing these capsules, and I asked them a simple question: instead of taking these capsules, why not have tomato? They said, well, sir, to have the amount of lycopene that is packed in a capsule, you will have to take 5 kilos of tomatoes. Now, that may again be true, and nobody can take 5 kilos of tomatoes. It's so easy to swallow a capsule. But then why do we have to depend only on lycopene for antioxidant function? When there are so many antioxidants available in such a wide variety of foods, why do we have to depend on only one single substance? And is it entirely desirable? Can too much of lycopene not be harmful? Now, these are questions which are generally left unanswered by this type of research. So one of the flaws in this research is that it's generally done on single foods, which ends up revealing only part of the truth, not the whole truth. The second thing is that we don't have to have each individual phytochemical because they have overlap. They seem to have overlapping functions. We just need a variety of them. We don't have to emphasize only one of them because they have overlapping functions. Then bioavailability. If we pack a nutrient in a capsule, we can't be sure whether it will be just as much available to us, whether it will be absorbed from the intestines as readily as when it is present as part of a whole food. Then too much of a good thing. Just because something is good doesn't mean that too much of it will be necessarily better. We saw it in the case of vitamin E when it was being promoted. Large amounts of vitamin E were taken, and then the drawbacks were noticed and the wave disappeared. These days, currently, the wave is that for vitamin D, again, heroic amounts are being given, and we may discover that that was not the most prudent thing to do, but then there may come up some other thing, and by the time all the letters of the alphabet have been exhausted, we'll be all dead and gone, and then the industry can start all over again. So essentially, old is gold. Take a variety of foods, and that includes food which will serve the traditional functions and also which will serve as medicine for prevention of disease and for treatment of disease. Turning to some of the questions, or rather the questions which are likely to be asked. What is the difference between a prebiotic and a probiotic? The difference is that probiotics are substances like dietary fiber, which serve as food for probiotics. And the probiotics are the microorganisms, that is those germs like bacteria and yeast, which are important for preserving the intestinal health, because we can have a large variety of population of these different types of bacteria. Some of them are very helpful, some of them are not. And to maintain the healthy ones, the more helpful ones, the ones which are good for our health, we can provide a certain type of food on which they thrive, and thereby provide competition to those germs which are not good for us. So that is the rationale for giving prebiotics. And dietary fiber, particularly water-soluble fiber, serves as food for these germs, and therefore we can use that as a probiotic. On the other hand, the microorganisms themselves, if we introduce those, then they also have, along with that, the food on which they can thrive. So a prebiotic and a probiotic can be given together to ensure that our intestinal tract would have good bacteria, helpful bacteria, providing good competition to the ones which may not be so helpful. But then while I mean prebiotic and probiotic capsules and other products are now available, what else is rice and curd or paratha and curd? Two very common combinations in the country. Rice or wheat will provide the prebiotic, and curd is a probiotic. Curd is a product which does have these microorganisms. Then what are genetically modified or GM foods, and are they safe? In genetically modified foods, a gene is introduced into a plant from another species. This is important to understand because a certain amount of genetic modification takes place in the natural world. For example, no child has exactly the same type of genetic makeup as his or her parents, and except in case of identical twins, even brothers and sisters do not have the same genetic makeup in spite of having the same father and mother. So the same thing happens also in plants, and sometimes it can be engineered for a particular purpose. For example, dwarf wheat with certain characteristics, which will be helpful in getting a big yield, was a result of making sure through artificial breeding of different species of wheat that we'll be able to get the type of wheat which the yield will be large, it will be dwarf so that it will not be easily damaged by a strong wind. And that was how Green Revolution was assured in. So that was also a type of genetic modification. Or say canola oil, reducing erucic acid in mustard oil. So that is also a genetic modification, but that is not what actually GM foods mean. GM food means that it is not the same species which has been bred in a designed manner to achieve a certain result. Here, the gene has been introduced from another species altogether. Sometimes it may be from an animal. An animal gene might have been introduced into a plant. For example, to preserve strawberries better in a freezer, what has been done is that the antifreeze product that fish make can be made by strawberries if you transplant the gene for this antifreeze product from a fish into strawberries. And that has been done. So that is a genetically modified food. So you are trying to introduce a certain character of one species into another by introducing the genes of one species into another species. Well, I mean, this is a remarkable achievement in science. People have raised safety concerns whether such foods will be safe. And the opinion on this is sharply divided. And the last word is yet to be said. Those who favor GM food say that, well, nothing has happened so far. People have been consuming them for more than 10 years. But then 10 years is a very short time for observing subtle long-term effects. And those who have apprehensions about these foods, they come up with a large number of arguments, weak in themselves, but all the same, those apprehensions are impossible to dismiss. Whether those things will not actually happen is something which is, in any case, very difficult to prove. Science cannot easily prove anything negative, that this is not something that can happen, because the duration required for the effect and the numbers in which it would happen cannot be easily studied. You cannot wait that long, and if it will happen only in a few people out of a large number, you'll never be able to study those large numbers. And if you do have populations where some sort of a natural experiment is going on, you'll not be able to easily attribute it to something like a GM food. So those apprehensions are impossible to dismiss, but all the same, they may be unfounded in the sense that they may just represent the natural tendency to resist change. Anything new is always resisted to start with. So the opinion is sharply divided, and it's difficult to be on one side or the other if one stays objective and dispassionate. But however, what is unquestionable are some of the social implications of some GM foods. Some GM foods, that is fruits, are designed to self-destruct their seeds. You might have seen papita without any seeds. These days, you get very sweet papita without any seeds, and so easy to eat. Very convenient for us. But what are the social implications? A small amount of these seeds for these plants are available with multinational corporations, which means that the farmer has now become dependent on these multinational corporations even to get the seed for planting the plant. So that those are the social implications of genetically modified foods. Now, a few foods which are quite fashionable these days. Moringa, drumstick, commonly eaten in India. The edible parts are the leaves and the fruits or the pods, those small stick-like things. Those are edible, but the bark and the pulp can be toxic, especially for pregnant women. They can induce abortion. The edible parts are rich in antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals. They're also a good source of potassium because on the whole, we tend to be a little low on this potassium side, and some of the foods which have this potassium are banana and citrus fruits and so on. But then again, instead of thinking in terms of single foods, better to think in terms of a judiciously chosen variety of foods. Everything, including potassium, would be taken care of. But then moringa is a good source of potassium. And there are several health claims that have been made for it, which are under investigation. Quinoa, it's a grain. And as you can see, it has a composition which is somewhat different from cereals and pulses. Carbohydrate 64%, not much to write home about, but protein 14%, certainly more than in a cereal, a little less than in a pulse, and then fat 6%, which cereals and pulses don't have in that much quantity. They have only very negligible amounts of fat. And then rich in dietary fiber, vitamins and minerals. And one of the things which again is perhaps been talked about a lot and its importance magnified, is gluten-free. While there are people who are sensitive to gluten and therefore they have to keep away from not only wheat, but also other grains which have some gluten like barley and consume only those grains which are gluten-free, and quinoa happens to be one of them. A large number of people are taking to gluten-free diets even without having any trouble with gluten. It has become fashionable. It's suspected that on the whole, a gluten-free diet will be healthier than a gluten-containing diet. Whether that is so is difficult to say, but all the same, quinoa is one of those which can cater to that fad for a gluten-free diet. Spirulina. It's an ecologically sound dietary supplement. Grows in water. It's an alga. Belongs to the class of blue-green algae. Composition-wise, carbohydrates only 24%, protein 60%, fat 8%. But then while the amount of protein and fat in some of these supplements is considerable, we have seen in the last few talks that we do not need that additional protein. All the protein that we need, both in terms of quantity and quality, can be met by a combination of cereals and pulses. And the minimum amount of fat that we need can also be met by the invisible fat in a diet which does not have any of these exotic foods. Spirulina is also rich in several vitamins and minerals, including iron. But like other plant products, it also does not contain vitamin B12. Chia seeds, again, a little unusual composition. Carbohydrates 42%, protein 16%, fat 31%, and vitamin and mineral rich. Pumpkin seeds, again something similar. Very little carbohydrate, quite a bit of protein, and a considerable amount of fat, 50%. Rich in fiber, vitamins, and minerals. That applies in general to these seeds, which have now become popular: single seed, melon seeds, pumpkin seeds, and a variety of other seeds all put together and mixed and sold as healthy seed combinations. By and large, as you would say, they are, compared to other grains, low in carbohydrate. And if it's low in carbohydrate and it has the same 10 to 15, 20% of water, the rest will be distributed between protein and fat. And both these are in fairly large amounts. But then we don't need that additional protein and fat. At least a healthy person does not need it if the diet is otherwise balanced and the person is taking enough of grains and fruits and vegetables. What do all these foods which are being promoted in common? Their origin actually is in ancient cultures, be it India, as in the case of particular spices. Spices we'll come to in a moment in a little greater detail, or be it these seeds which have been consumed in ancient cultures, or be it olive oil, which was used in Mediterranean diets. The origin of all these new fats, essentially in ancient cultures, in a way shows the current trend that cultures which were considered outdated and outmoded, the world has started looking at them once more because these populations tend to be in good health. And then one or the other item in their diet is picked up, sometimes in isolation, torn out of context, and promoted as a health food. Another thing that they have in common is that they are in general high in protein or fat or both. We do not need the additional protein, we do not need the additional fat, but then that is not the only reason why we should not have too much of them, because if we have the rest of the diet as much as we should have, in addition, we have a lot of these supplementary items which are high in protein and fat, the total energy intake will go up. And if the total energy intake goes up, then no matter how healthy the diet otherwise is, the person will put on weight. And if the person puts on weight, irrespective of everything else, the person is likely to have a high cholesterol level and also increase the risk for just about every other lifestyle disease. And this is one basic thing which we have to remember. So this is important to keep in mind when we start having these extra items in the diet. Of course, they're high in fiber, vitamins, and minerals, and are likely to have also a variety of other protective phytochemicals. These are all plant products, and they have all these protective phytochemicals. So in a way, the world has come full circle. Observing these ancient cultures, modern science is once again promoting some of these items which have been eaten by people for thousands of years. It all started with actually a reductionist approach, trying to eliminate everything that was unnecessary. So what seemed to be necessary was just carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And in keeping with this, there's a remarkable experiment that was done by a young medical student in the 18th century. His name was William Stark. He thought that all the other things that are being eaten by people are just for taste, for sensory satisfaction. And we don't need so many items in food. For all, bread and water alone should be enough. So he went on a bread and water diet. And he developed the bleeding from the gums and a few other things, indicative of various vitamin deficiencies, etc. And then he started adding items one by one to see which of the additional items was really necessary. So he added sugar, he added milk, and so on. And milk seemed to do the maximum amount of good to him. But then he didn't continue with that because he wanted to try other items which may be added to a bread and water diet and see which is that single minimum addition that will be just enough. And the result was that he started growing weak, started getting many diseases, maybe due to reduced immunity, and died within 1 year of starting the experiment. So he paid a price for his curiosity, and this attempt at this enlightened by this reductionist approach, let me find out that minimum that is necessary. Wish he had at least paid heed to the biblical warning, man doesn't live by bread alone, although it was said in a different context. But then this poor boy at the young age of less than 30 succumbed to this curiosity and his desire to provide the world some useful knowledge in the field of nutrition. His name was William Stark. But then it was soon realized by the 19th century that and early 20th century that carbohydrates, proteins, and fats are necessary but not sufficient. We also need vitamins and minerals. And then it was found that therefore grains are necessary but not sufficient. To get vitamins and minerals, we should add fruits and vegetables because grains alone will not be able to provide enough of those. And in the Indian diet, it has been traditional to also add spices, which are a very concentrated supply of protective phytochemicals. So they're not only for fragrance and taste, they are a concentrated source of protective phytochemicals. So they're dry, very little water, hardly any carbohydrate, protein, and fat. So they're essentially protective phytochemicals. And in the Indian diet, it has been also customary to add a small amount of nuts, not essential but optional, but a small amount, say 5 almonds or 2 walnut halves or something like that, not too much of them. So that has been customary in India. And this type of a diet, which has unrefined grains, fruits and vegetables, spices, and a small amount of nuts, is actually a balanced diet, and nothing more needs to be done to make it more satisfactory. We'll spend a little time on spices, because in contrast with some of the other foods that are being promoted, you have to make an additional effort to remember that, well, my normal diet may not be providing me everything I need, so let me add a little of pumpkin seeds or spirulina or quinoa or whatever. So you have to make an effort. In case of spices, they get into the food while cooking, so there's an effortless inclusion. Predictable, everyday effortless inclusion by an entire population, not only by those who can afford health foods and dietary supplements. Almost everybody takes some spices. And it's difficult to take too much of them, because then the food will not be proper. I mean, for proper cooking, you need only a certain amount of these spices, neither too much nor too little. So it's difficult to go into an excess. And in any case, they do not have protein and fat, and therefore you can't put on weight by having spices, which can happen if one takes indiscriminately, in addition to what one should be taking, a large amount of some of these high protein and high fat supplements. Compared to those supplements, they are also relatively inexpensive, and they are culturally compatible in India. They do not come with this baggage of proteins and fats, which can add to the caloric content, which can be useful if you want a high caloric density diet. Say when a person is recovering from a disease or has recently undergone surgery, or for a child who is been malnourished for some time and you want quick catch-up growth. Now, those are the situations where this type of high caloric density of the diet may be important, and this type of high calorie items, which give more calories in a relatively small volume, can be useful, but not in a normal diet for a healthy person. So spices don't come with that sort of an extra baggage of proteins and fats. And further, we don't have to just take an indiscriminate mixture of spices. Some guidance on variation in which spices are more desirable and which spices should be avoided, depending upon the season and the prakriti of the individual, is also available in Ayurveda, which means you can even individualize the variety of spices that a person takes in a particular season. And of course, they add to the taste and fragrance of the food. Now, this knowledge will come in greater detail, perhaps from an Ayurveda expert. We'll have Ayurveda experts here once again in this program on the 16th and the 19th of this month. But these are some of the spices which are acceptable round the year, irrespective of season. Dry ginger, and these are the names in Hindi and quite popular, at least in the north of the country. Adrak powder or sunthi, turmeric or haldi, small cardamom or choti ilaichi, clove or long pepper or pipali, mint, pudina, and lemongrass. These are acceptable round the year. I'm not trying to divide the year into the 6 seasons as Ayurveda does, but more in the common sort of language. In summers, one may avoid black pepper, kali mirch, against common knowledge, wet ginger, adrak, which you add to the vegetables while cooking, so that should be avoided. Powder is okay, but not wet ginger. A little powder to the milk or something is okay, but not wet ginger. So black pepper. And this knowledge can also be useful while making herbal tea. You don't have to add all the herbs to the herbal tea. Any 3 or 4 are enough out of the combination, which is okay round the year. Take 3 or 4 and you'll get good herbal tea, whatever happens to be readily available. In summers, one has to then, while making herbal tea, be careful to avoid some of these. Ajwain or osimum or the holy basil or tulsi, and cinnamon, dalchini, saffron or kesar, these are to be avoided in summers. And again, it's a folk knowledge that garam hote hain, they are hot in their effects, so we avoid them. In the rainy season, one should avoid rainy season, as well as winters, one should avoid saunf. Again, this a common knowledge sort of that thandi hoti hai. So you can take it in summers, but not in winters. And then rains also saffron, and winters also dhania and gulab. Again, gulab ka sharbat you take only in summers, not in winters. So some of this is folk knowledge. And the most difficult period in a way, what is called in Ayurveda Sharad, the Sharad Ritu, roughly from the 15th September to the 15th of November in the Northern Hemisphere. In this season, because this is a sort of a funny season. The summer is gone, but winter has not yet come. The rains have gone, but the atmosphere may still be quite damp. So you're neither here nor there, because summer can be of two types. It can be warm and dry, or it can warm and dry or warm and windy. So warm is Pitta and windy is Vata, or it can be warm and damp. Warm is Pitta and damp is Kapha, heavy. So there you have something clear cut. But in Sharad, you are neither here nor there, neither too dry nor too damp, neither too cold nor too hot. And that's why, although it's called the fall season, and fall has beautiful foliage in some parts of the world, this is not the best in terms of health. And therefore, there are a large number of spices which should be avoided in this particular season. Wet ginger, Om or Ajwain, big cardamom, badi ilaichi, black pepper, kali mirch, osmum and or the holy basil, tulsi, and cinnamon, dalchini, saffron, kesar. So large number of them avoided, but still we have enough which are okay around the year. So nothing much to worry about. Well, sort of, you may say, on the whole, say yes or no to some of these items which we have discussed. Basically, grains, fruits, and vegetables remain the backbone of a healthy diet. And the grains should be whole, unrefined. We'll come to this again in the next session when we talk about the balanced diets. The rest of the items of the diet are basically accessories. And the culturally compatible accessories in the Indian diet are spices and nuts. Spices even more than nuts. And that is, in fact, as it should be. And if everyone has to take any dietary supplements apart from this, if you are interested in one of the single foods also like quinoa or spirulina or any of these, or pumpkin seeds, you may take one or two in moderation, but not all of them. Sometimes, people hear of one thing, this is very healthy, let me get it. That is very healthy, let me get it. That is very healthy. And they start taking all of them every day. Even if you are taking a variety of them, if you're taking one today, take another one tomorrow, at least not all of them on the same day. And also not totally indiscriminately, as far as possible. Keep in mind their caloric content, and if possible, also their effect on the doshas in terms of Ayurvedic knowledge. And on the whole, any of these food supplements or dietary supplements are much, much better than any pills and capsules. So these would be the general guidelines which you can follow while adopting a dispassionate reasoned attitude to the type of items that we have discussed today. A judicious variety of foods, judiciously chosen, not judicial. The courts don't have to decide it. You can be judicious without approaching a court of law. A judicious variety of foods is the key to a healthy diet. But then while variety is important, widening the variety of foods in our diet is important, widening the consciousness can perhaps do us more good than widening the range of the foods that we take. Because the mind has a profound effect on the body. And we again keep returning to that again and again. If you are sattvic by nature, any type of diet will do us much more good than if we are tamasic or rajasic. So promote sattva and widen the range of consciousness. Go into the deepest self to observe that we are more than the body and the mind. Observe the divine within, and then observe the divine without, everywhere else, in everybody else. That is the widening of the consciousness, seeing that oneness and unity with the rest of the creation. Developing that type of an awareness and giving an expression to it in our outer life through greater love, that can do us more good than just going on widening the range of foods on the basis of this scientific report or that scientific report or this particular item in the popular press or that item in the popular press. Those things will not help us that much. The suggested reading, some of this material you'll find in chapter 7 of this book, Eating Wisely and Well. the title of the chapter is New Kids on the Block. This is a picture postcard view of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, the place from where I'm speaking, where I live and work. And now the COVID restrictions have been lifted, so guests are welcome. So we look forward to seeing you sometime here. And if there are any questions beyond what we have talked today so far, you can still drop an email to yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making the session possible. Thank you all for a patient listening.
There's a question in the chat box. What about herbs? When you were talking about the solution, I guess.
Yes, herbs. Firstly, I mean, tea is also itself a herb. Many other herbs can be made into what is called tea, although it may not contain tea. And all the spices that we're talking about, some of them can be used for making herbal tea. So that is the way one can look at herbs.
Good morning, Dr. Bijlani.
Good morning,
Thank you
madam.
so much for this wonderful morning. I have two questions. Now, in Ayurveda, we generally believe, we believe definitely that our digestive system and the running of our digestive system is associated directly with the sun and the sun clock. So, like you mentioned, when we're talking about the spices, and especially soft to be avoided during rains. Now in rains, our digestive agni is compromised because the sun is not that vibrant, and soft does help as a digestive aid. So how would you, recommend the use of soft during rainy season? That is my first question.
Okay,
And
let's finish the first question first. The simple answer to that is that what applies to good health doesn't apply to disease states. So in Ayurveda, that's another one of the principles that you can make an exception in a disease state. So if Saunf or Ajwain will help the stomach and the intestines improve the digestion, or then that can be used.
Okay. And similarly, Tulsi, avoiding Tulsi in summers. I mean, it was mentioned in that list of things to be avoided in summers, but the use of chia seeds, sabja seeds is very prevalent as a coolant during summers. In fact, these days, just like you say, just because something is good doesn't necessarily means that more of it is better, but then we see the use of sabja seeds, sabja pudding for breakfast and stuff like that. So in abundance, it's being used just to keep the body cool. So how does that work? Because sabja is also basically basil seeds.
Well, that's a question I must confess I'm not sure about. The general sort of list does include that Tulsi is not okay around the year.
Okay.
Popularly the way it's said is garam hoti aur khushk hoti hai. Khushk means dries up. So that's why during certain seasons it is not the best thing to take. But at the same time, again, small amounts or exceptional situations, that may be okay. But then what we have to sort of keep in mind is that with this new knowledge, without using Ayurvedic principles, sometimes it has become common to take some of the things, including as many of these components as possible, round the year. That is what has to be avoided. Like multigrain, I was talking about the other day about multigrain. Again, it doesn't mean that the more the number of grains you mix, the better. Better to avoid bajra in summers and to avoid, say, barley in summers. Barley is good for summers, not bajra. For winters, bajra will be good, barley will not be good. So multigrain also, what type of multigrain? In the same way, herbal tea, which spices? So one can give a little thought to that rather than just feel that just because it's herbal tea or just because it's multigrain, it will be good round the year.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bijlani.
Can we have fresh coconut water with breakfast?
Sure, we can have fresh coconut water. It's sterile, it's isotonic, good for replacing water loss, electrolyte loss, even in diarrhea, better than Electral. So good. So even a healthy person can take.
Can we take natural supplements like ashwagandha, turmeric, etc. for the general well-being?
Well, ashwagandha would come more under the category of drugs rather than food supplements. So such things are better taken under the advice of an Ayurvedic physician. What was the other food apart from ashwagandha?
Ashwagandha, turmeric, etc.
Turmeric, yes. Turmeric is not a drug. Turmeric can be taken. And one good way of taking turmeric regularly is to have it in milk.
How about chili powder?
You mean red chili powder, probably. Probably what you mean by chili powder is red chili powder. I deliberately kept it out because it doesn't suit everybody and it's not absolutely essential. But all the same, if it suits you in moderate amounts, it's okay. It has capsaicin. Capsaicin is there in green chilies as well as red chilies. And does have physiological functions. But all the same, it's not indispensable. Too much of it can be harmful to anybody, particularly if a person has gastritis, tendency towards a peptic ulcer or piles. Such people will not be able to tolerate red chilies.
Okay, garlic in summer.
Garlic, again, I wouldn't be very sure about which season is okay and which season one should avoid. But all the same, garlic has also been used quite a bit for lowering cholesterol levels. And the general recommendation is 1 pod soaked in honey. And again, the Ayurvedic experts will be with us on 16th and 19th. We can keep this question for them. There is some research in modern science also on garlic, confirming some of these effects. There's plenty of research also on turmeric. So these single items have been taken up one by one, some of them for their effect on blood cholesterol, some on blood sugar, and by and large, the results are positive. The only drawback remains in these cases, particularly when it comes to blood sugar, is that the dose is difficult to standardize. And therefore, you can't be very sure what amount will just keep the blood sugar under normal levels and what amount may lead to hypoglycemia. So those, and especially when you couple it with the drug treatment, to what extent to reduce the dose of the drug if these items are also being taken. So those are gray areas, but otherwise there are at least 100 herbs by now, plant products, which have been shown to at least help in reducing the blood sugar. And in some cases, the mechanism is quite different from that of the oral hypoglycemic agents used in modern scientific medicine. So the approach is quite different. And some of these might help in regeneration of the pancreas. Probably that's what we'll discover, or improve the sensitivity of the tissues to insulin, which means reduce insulin resistance. Those are the alternative mechanisms by which perhaps some of these things work. that was shown also for dietary fiber long back, that does seem to improve the sensitivity of the peripheral tissues to insulin. So reduces insulin resistance. So therefore, there is a great deal sort of one can expect from this type of an integrated approach, using modern scientific medicine for a quick, sure, predictable effect, and using these for going further a little deeper into the root of the problem through a slow approach.
We still have some time in case anybody of you wants to unmute and ask.
Good morning, sir, and thank you very much for a very elaborate and yet very comprehensive approach, combining the ancient knowledge from Ayurveda as well as the modern principle-oriented approach. Now there are so many phytochemicals which are available in the form of supplements, and about which the dosages are also not very clear. So what would be your suggestion for this? Because they are not also standardized like unlike pharmaceutical industry. So what would be your suggestion for this?
The best that I can say is that one should not go in for purified chemicals, purified single principles. Instead, depend upon natural foods. That's why one of the last recommendations was foods are much better than pills and capsules. So going for natural foods, it's almost impossible to take too much of something through natural foods, except those which are high protein and high fat foods, by which at least one may get additional calories, which may not be desirable. But otherwise, when it comes to micronutrients or phytochemicals, it's almost impossible to take an excess that will do us harm by taking natural foods.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Could you please describe the difference between prebiotic and probiotic foods?
Prebiotic, you see, is the material which germs can use. Probiotic is the germs itself. You put the two together, you have germs and you have food available for them, readily available in the same meal. So that way you are able to promote the type of germs which you have introduced into the body. So you introduce healthy germs as you do in curd, and they can promote them. And once their population grows, it will provide competition for nutrients to the other germs which may not be so useful. So that's how the prebiotic-probiotic combinations work.
What is the best way to consume neem? Is it recommended to have it daily?
May not be every day, but certainly in certain seasons when the focus is on bitter, pungent, and astringent tastes, as say in the months of March, April. That time, yes, neem can be useful, a good source of way of getting important phytochemicals through a taste that is fundamentally bitter. And another, of course, important use of neem, as you know, is cleaning the teeth for dental hygiene. Again, an excellent plant for dental hygiene. Also good for many skin conditions.
What happens if curd is consumed in dinner too?
It's difficult to say what happens, because apparently nothing happens to most people. But all the same, the general recommendation is that one should not take curd at night. Yet a lot of people do. Nothing apparently happens. And my usual sort of approach to this type of a situation is, firstly, that just because nothing dramatic happens, it doesn't mean that nothing actually happens. There could be a slow, subtle, long-term effect, which is not easy to observe and relate to the curd. You may not be able to attribute that slow, long-term effect to the curd. For example, if one gets a little more attacks of arthritis or a little more attack of dermatitis, the person cannot directly say it's because I'm having curd at night. The second thing is that age makes a lot of difference. If a person is young, this person may be able to get away with many irregularities. As the person gets older, paying a little attention to these things may help the person escape many problems, which are not purely because of age, but all the same, the age does lead to a decline in various functions, including digestive function. So what he could get away with in young age, he may not be able to get away with it. So this knowledge can be more useful in old age than in young age. So this is the sort of general approach I have to this. What will happen if one takes curd at night? And third thing is whether one takes it regularly or one takes it once in a while. Once in a while, anybody will be able to get away with it, irrespective of age, perhaps. But taking it regularly exposes us to those subtle long-term effects. Of course, as Aditi is asking the other day, what is the definition of once in a while? Very difficult, just like saying what is the definition of, what is the way you can distinguish necessities from luxuries? Something like that. You should cater to necessities, but not luxuries. But then where do necessities stop and become luxuries? Very difficult. It's an arbitrary line, and the same applies to once in a while.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sir, I have missed some lectures. I hope that they are available on recording, sir.
Yes, they're all available. Aditi is
Yes,
very
sir.
meticulous, irrespective of how much time it takes her. She
Sir.
tries to make sure that the class
So-
recording is uploaded the same day.
Yes, sir. So I have to visit this S website, sir.
Yes, website. Not
Okay,
website,
thank you.
YouTube channel. The
Acha, okay,
recordings
sir. Okay,
are
sir.
on the YouTube channel, not on the website.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
And what you have to type, if you've never been there, what you have to type is yes, spirituality, a single word. The same S
Yes, sir.
stands for yes and spirituality. Yes, spirituality, YouTube channel. If you put this, you'll
Okay.
get this entry at the top. If you
Thank
don't
you,
put
thank
all of this, what will happen is you'll get a large number of channels which are devoted to spiritual topics.
Okay.
So yes,
No,
spirituality is a
I'll
single
sort
word.
it out, sir.
Yes,
I'll sort it
spirituality
out.
is a single word.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Sir, just one query, small query, that it is often recommended that you should go for taking Arjun bark kadha for some heart-related issues or BP-related issues. So I want to know that in what mode it would be better to have it, sir. Your voice is not coming, sir.
I think we leave this question for the Ayurveda expert because we are moving
Okay.
away from what is food to an area which is being used as medicine.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Next question is, what can be said about the amount of nuts such as almonds or walnuts? What is the healthy limit?
Well, arbitrarily, as I said, 5 badams or 2 walnut halves. But then if a person is working physically very hard, you can exceed a little. If the person is putting on weight, he can reduce this. But that arbitrary limit, which is conventional, is quite okay. The arbitrary amount, which is conventional. And also, if one tries to take all of them on the same day, one is likely to exceed. If you take almonds and almonds and pista and kaju and walnut on the same day, more likely that you will exceed the amount that should be taken, and the amount of fat will become so much that one will start putting. So even if you want to take a variety, take one of them on one day and another one the next day, or take one of them for 1 month and another one for the next 1 month. So whichever way sort of is convenient.
Sir, the best way of taking flaxseed.
Flaxseed we did talk about when we were talking about fats. It is a supplement, not essential. Provides us N3 type of polyunsaturated fat. And if I remember correctly, what we talked the other day, the upper limit is 15 grams a day, not more than that. And it could have important drug interactions with drugs which are used as blood thinners, etc., because it may lead to bleeding. If those painkillers and blood thinning agents and so on, it has an important interaction with them. It can increase the bleeding tendency. So flaxseed should be taken carefully. And if one is taking an otherwise balanced diet, it should not be necessary. One can get the N3 polyunsaturated fat from mustard oil or canola oil or soybean oil instead of depending upon a supplement.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Can weak eyesight be reversed by any kind of food?
Weak eyesight, you see, is a end result of, can be the end result of a very wide variety of diseases. And if one is talking of, say, difficulty in dark adaptation in a child, chances are that's vitamin A deficiency, and you can correct it quite quickly with vitamin A supplements. But if weak eyesight is due to a retinal problem like macular degeneration, almost impossible to do anything about it. Leave aside diet, there's hardly any treatment. So, it depends upon the type of problem. When it comes to, say, refractive errors, which are the commonest reason for a weak eyesight, then the quick solution is glasses, corrects it immediately. But a slower solution, which will work partly and it will work more in young age than in old age, is various types of eye exercises rather than diet.
Okay, the next question is, why are some foods as addictive as chocolates or coffee? Is it more beneficial to avoid them than to take them?
Yes, this is not strictly speaking addiction, it is called dependence. The difference is that in case of addiction, when there are severe withdrawal symptoms. In case of dependence, it's primarily psychological. If one tries to use his willpower to not to take, nothing physical will happen, as we know how. So in case of tea, coffee, chocolate, can be a dependence. And that is because of caffeine and related compounds. Tea and coffee have caffeine. Chocolate and others have related compounds. These can all create what is called dependence. That is a psychological craving, a psychological feeling that I need it. If one takes it a fixed time every day, you start feeling that something is missing and one wants to take it. But at the same time, if one uses willpower not to take, nothing really will happen to the person. The person will not get the type of withdrawal symptoms which come from withdrawal symptoms, which can be serious and dangerous, which happens in case of addictions.
So then is it beneficial to avoid them or to take them?
And that is a personal choice. That's a personal choice. When it comes to tea and coffee, which is a much more common problem than chocolate, when it comes to tea and coffee, there is a certain amount which is considered medically safe, which means essentially harmless. And that is about 2 cups of tea a day or 1 cup of coffee a day. Coffee less because generally the way it is made, 1 cup of coffee ends up having double the amount of caffeine as compared to a cup of tea. So that is sort of the limit which will essentially be harmless for most people. But then if a person has a tendency to gastritis, even this much causes problem, then better that the person doesn't take it at all. But the other way of looking at it is that if a person wants to go for a purely sattvic diet, wants to overcome the desire for anything that is unnecessary or potentially harmful, then it's better to use the willpower to give it up completely. And as I said, I mean, even if the person has been accustomed to it, nothing really will happen, except that for a few days, the person will have that craving, will miss it, but may at the most get a mild headache, but nothing much will happen if the person gives it up using that willpower. And then the person can also get the satisfaction corresponding to have done something difficult and get a little kick out of it, which is totally harmless. So the person can certainly do that. Another thing is that if a person is otherwise on the spiritual journey and is trying to move from rajas towards sattva, and this person is then taking, this tea and coffee, what happens is that gradually what he observes is he starts becoming more sensitive to the effects of tea and coffee. The effect of tea and coffee is to increase the heart rate. Now, this person's heart rate goes up much more than that of a person, ordinary person. So even this person's own heart rate did not go up that much on taking a cup of tea when he was more rajasic. As he has molded himself, worked on himself, and is going towards more sattva, he finds that his heart rate goes up more. So the pharmacological effects of these chemicals start getting exaggerated on the path of yoga or spirituality. As the person moves more towards sattva, the pharmacological effects, be it staying awake at night, with difficulty in falling asleep, or be it the heart rate, they get exaggerated when the person is on this path. So then, that actually stimulates sometimes the person to give it up. One via media, which one can find, say if you live in an environment where it is not very convenient to give it up completely, or in winters you feel cold and you feel that a little hot drink and the only hot drink available is this tea or coffee, so let me take a little. The via media is try to avoid it at least once or twice a week. If you avoid it once or twice a week, you'll not get even dependent on it. So take it 5 days a week and without thinking too much about it. So don't think much about it and keep giving it up as and when convenient, roughly once or twice a week. And one will be able to escape the dependence, and yet life can remain convenient.
All right, I think that is all for the questions in the chat box. So we come to the closing of yet another session. Thank you everyone for joining in. Our next class will be on Monday, practical class on the sitting postures. And all of you are also welcome to join us for the YES talk tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. Dr. Belu Mehra will be speaking on learner as a soul in evolution and dharma-centric education. So you can use the same Zoom link and join us if interested. And as usual, we close with the music. Thank you everyone once again.
Thank you, sir.